Exactly 550 years ago, a war of all things drew the Old Swiss Confederacy into European politics. In the Burgundian Wars, the Swiss faced Charles the Bold, who dreamed of transforming his Duchy of Burgundy into a kingdom stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. The realization of that dream seemed within reach, when his ambitions collided with those of the small Swiss Confederacy. Standing in the way of its powerful neighbor, the Confederates faced overwhelming odds. But then, something unexpected happened. The Swiss militia defeated the modern Burgundian army and shattered Charles's dream of a kingdom. Within just 3 years, the Burgundian Wars transformed the balance of power in Europe. They demonstrated that the Swiss Confederacy could hold its own against the continent's greatest powers, and marked the rise of the Swiss infantry, who would become some of the most feared and sought-after mercenaries in Europe.
The consequence was a shift in the balance of power and, ultimately, the rise of the Habsburgs beyond the borders of their Austrian territories. With the Burgundian Wars, the region of the Swiss Confederacy finally became a reservoir of mercenaries for the European powers, which could now recruit large numbers of experienced fighters here. Fighters they wanted to ensure would not turn against them either independently or in the service of another power.
This is Professor Regula Schmid-Kehling from the University of Bern. She's an expert in medieval military history and, on the occasion of the 550th anniversary of the Burgundian Wars, is once again taking a close look at this conflict. In this video, with her support, we set out to trace the Burgundian Wars, to understand how this confrontation came about, which interests clashed, and why these wars permanently altered the balance of power in late medieval Europe. This is how modern historiography tells the story of the Burgundian Wars. The maelstrom of events that drew the Old Swiss Confederacy into the Burgundian Wars began with the end of an old feud. For decades, the powerful House of Habsburg had been a sworn enemy of the Confederates.
The Habsburgs are a noble house that originated in what is now Switzerland. Their ancestral castle, Habsburg, is located in the present-day canton of Aargau. They held estates and rights across the region, especially on the Swiss plateau and in eastern Switzerland. Over time, they faced increasing competition, particularly from cities, but also from valley communities that were striving for greater autonomy, often in quite aggressive ways. The Battle of Sempach in 1386 was one such conflict, emerging from the assertive actions of the city of Lucerne and its allies against their territorial lord. These actions provoked a violent response. One key turning point was the so-called conquest of Aargau in 1415, during which the Bernese and the other Confederates, in a very rapid campaign is almost too strong a word, it was more like a takeover, seized Habsburg cities and rights and refused to return them.
After this escalation, tensions shimmered for around 50 years before flaring up again in 1468, during the War of Waldshut, or Waldshuter Krieg. Sigismund of Habsburg, the Duke of Austria, found himself confronted with a more powerful Swiss Confederacy than ever before. Unable to match it on his own, he sought a more powerful patron, and found one in Charles the Bold of Burgundy, who, on the 9th of May 1469, in the Treaty of Saint-Omer, promised him military support and a loan of 50,000 guilders. In return, Sigismund pledged Alsace, the southern Black Forest, and the four towns of Waldshut, Laufenburg, Bad Säckingen, and Rheinfelden as a collateral. This pledge made Burgundy a direct neighbor of the Swiss Confederacy. Charles's deputy in Alsace, Bailiff Peter von Hagenbach, prohibited the pledged territories from trading grain with the cities along the Upper Rhine, imposed heavy taxes, and tyrannized the population. This alarmed the Swiss. The city-state of Bern, in particular, viewed these developments with suspicion, fearing that its new neighbor might cut off important trade routes across the Swiss plateau. But before the Bernese could intervene, a diplomatic turn occurred. Almost 5 years after the Treaty of Saint-Omer, Charles had still taken no action against the Swiss, and Sigismund was forced to accept that his patron would not honor the treaty. He therefore decided to take a completely different course of action.
In a rather surprising turn of events, he then turned to the Confederates, after having previously been allied with the Burgundians against them, and concluded a peace treaty, the so-called Perpetual Accord or Ewige Richtung of 1474. That was a crucial moment, as it also marked a shift in the entire constellation of alliances at the European level.
On the 30th of March 1474, the Swiss Confederates and Sigismund signed a peace treaty and alliance, bringing their long-standing enmity to an end. 1 day later, the 8 cantons of the Old Swiss Confederacy joined with the Lower League, an alliance between Sigismund, the cities of Basel, Colmar, Strasbourg and Sélestat, as well as the bishops of Basel and Strasbourg. On the basis of this new alliance, a front against Charles the Bold was formed, the Anti-Burgundian League, which, led by Strasbourg, Basel, Bern and Lucerne, opposed Burgundian expansion.
And yes, truly from one day to the next, Charles the Bold found himself facing a relatively unified large territory as an adversary. A large territory because thousands of fighters and, above all, supplies could be recruited and procured from this region.
After the formation of this new alliance, events unfolded rapidly. With the backing of his new allies, Sigismund broke away from Burgundy. He annulled the Treaty of Saint-Omer and repaid Charles's loan in order to redeem the pledged territories. But Charles refused to return them because he had a dream.
A royal crown. He wanted a crown, and he wanted a kingdom situated between the Holy Roman Empire and France. His grandfather had already sought a royal crown. After all, they were descended from kings. It is about independence, about breaking free from nominal dependence on the French crown, but also on the German king. At the time Charles inherited it, the Burgundian realm was divided into 2 parts. On the one hand, the northern region, the Burgundian Netherlands, and on the other, more or less the region we know today as Burgundy. In between lies a corridor that is unoccupied. The goal was to unite these territories and secure a royal title and a crown for the entire realm, or possibly for parts of it. And to that end, he made all kinds of advances.
Presumably, Charles had intended from the start to keep the pledged lands because, along with Lorraine, these were precisely the territories he needed to create the continuous empire he dreamed of. The Duke of Burgundy was well aware that this refusal risked a military conflict with Sigismund and his allies, but he did not shy away from confrontation, as he commanded one of the most modern armies of the time. Charles used the immense wealth of his duchy to transform his forces into a professional military machine. He was in the process of organizing them according to the so-called ordinances, that is, binding regulations, and replacing the short-term levies common at the time with permanent, paid, and thoroughly trained troops. The reforms were not yet complete, and would not be finished during Charles's lifetime, but the army had already developed significantly. As a distinguished mark, the soldiers wore a red St. Andrew's cross on their tunics, a novelty at the time. The central tactical unit was the so-called lance, a fixed combat group organized around a heavily armored man-at-arms. These professional forces were supported by state-of-the-art extensive artillery. Anyone who stood in Charles's way had to face this military juggernaut. Nevertheless, the first armed confrontation was not long in coming. In the spring of 1474, the people of the imperial cities in Alsace had enough of Peter von Hagenbach's tyranny. During an uprising, they captured the hated bailiff, put him on trial, and beheaded him. In response, the bailiff's brother, Stefan von Hagenbach, marched into southern Alsace with 6,000 mercenaries and took brutal revenge, systematically ravaging the region. This raid is considered the immediate trigger of the Burgundian Wars, as the anti-Burgundian League subsequently declared war on Charles. In the fall, an army of 18,000 men marched into Franche-Comté and laid siege to the town of Héricourt. When the Burgundians rushed to relieve the fortress, the League routed them with 2 surprising cavalry counterattacks. Despite the Swiss' participation in the attack, Charles ignored the Confederacy for the time being. The Duke of Burgundy had more pressing concerns. Because he was besieging Neuss, a town near Düsseldorf, the Emperor had declared a Reichskrieg, an imperial war, against him. This came just at the right time for the Bernese, who had long harbored ambitions to expand their territory westward. In 1475, they sent raiding parties into the Vaud region on 2 occasions.
Bern had been pursuing a very active expansionist policy for some time. It was certainly driven in part by economic interests. It also appears to have been aimed at further weakening Savoy, which was seen as vulnerable at the time, as well as taking the opportunity to annex wealthy territories there and push back against Jacques of Savoy. The Burgundians were perceived as a threat. So it was a mixture of aggressive action and, to a significant extent, preventive measures.
The Bernese militia captured 16 towns, 43 castles, and forced their inhabitants to swear allegiance to Bern. In doing so, they confronted Charles's ally, Jacques of Savoy, the Count of Romont, and the Burgundian vassals in the Vaud region. At the same time, the Bernese's second foray into Vaud, the Upper Valaison, conquered Lower Valais, which also belonged to Savoy. On the morning of the 13th of November, they defeated Duchess Yolande's army at the Battle of Planta and went on to occupy the valley as far as the Great St. Bernard Pass and Saint-Maurice. In parallel with these events, another political shift took place. That summer, Charles the Bald and the Emperor settled their differences, and just a few weeks later, the Duke of Burgundy also made peace with his personal enemy, Louis XI of France. With that, Charles had brought his conflicts with his 2 most powerful adversaries to an end. He was now free to move forward with his plans for a unified kingdom. What he still lacked was the heart of his empire, the missing piece of his puzzle that would connect his territories. In November of 1475, Charles the Bald invaded Lorraine. René II, the Duke of Lorraine, was not prepared for such an attack.
The Duke of Lorraine, René, was still very young and had only recently ascended to the throne. Before that, there had been a regent in place, and this too presented a favorable opportunity. Indeed, after the unsuccessful siege of Neuss, Charles went into Lorraine and quickly conquered it, occupying the city of Nancy and driving René out.
After occupying Lorraine, Charles turned his attention to Bern, which he had identified as the driving force behind the Confederates' anti-Burgundian policy. Seeking retribution for the incursions into the Vaud region, he marched south from Nancy on the 11th of January with an army of around 12,000 men. The first blow against the Bernese was struck by the Count of Romont, Jacques of Savoy. At the head of the Burgundian vanguard of 1,200 men, he crossed the border at the Col de Jounier, overran Orbe, and pursued the fleeing Bernese as far as Yverdon at the southwestern end of Lake Neuchâtel. He was not deterred by the city either. During the night of the 12th to the 13th of January, 1476, some of his men scaled the walls and overpowered the guards. A bloody street fight ensued, its tide ebbing and flowing, until the defenders retreated into the castle. There, they continued their resistance until the Duke finally had the buildings set on fire. Even then, the defenders refused to give up. Instead, they stormed through the burning gate and threw themselves at the besiegers with their last remaining strength. For all their bravery, this would certainly have been their death sentence, had 80 men from Fribourg not arrived at the very moment and attacked the assailants from the flank. Believing the unexpected reinforcements to be a much larger Swiss army, the Count of Romont immediately retreated. This gave the garrison the time it needed to leave Yverdon and make its way to Grandson, the second city in Vaud still under Bernese control. The men had no idea that this decision would seal their fate. Meanwhile, a Bernese army was indeed on its way to Vaud. However, it numbered only 7,000 men, leaving the Bernese dependent on the support of the other cantons. However, they hesitated to send aid, believing that Bern had brought this upon itself with its warmongering, and should now face the consequences alone. It was not until the 18th of February that the Federal Diet of Switzerland, or Tagsatzung, the assembly of the delegates of the cantons of the Old Swiss Confederacy, finally decided to send troops to Vaud. In the meantime, Charles the Bald crossed the Col de Jounier with nearly 20,000 men and a massive artillery train. On the 19th of February, he set up his banners before Grandson, established a fortified camp at the Arnon River, and began the siege of the town. For 3 exhausting and costly days, the 500-man garrison held out against a superior force. Then they abandoned the town and retreated to the castle. But the castle, however well fortified it may have been, was not built to withstand bombardment from modern artillery. By the 28th of February, it was so severely damaged that the defenders were forced to surrender. Charles then revealed his most brutal side. Presumably to intimidate the Bernese and their allies, he made an example of the 412 survivors, having them hanged or drowned in the lake. Despite its defeat, the garrison of Grandson had rendered a great service to the Old Swiss Confederacy. During the 10 days it had held back the Burgundians, the Swiss mobilization finally got underway. Warriors from other cantons drew nearer, eager to avenge the massacre at Grandson, for which they felt responsible due to their earlier hesitation. Charles's plan thus backfired. Instead of intimidating his enemies, the executions fueled hatred toward the Burgundians. The 18,000 men who had gathered at Beauvais by the 1st of March were eager to make Charles pay for his cruelty. When the Duke learned that the Swiss were approaching from the north, he established an advanced defensive line along the Rivière de la Vaud. He blocked their route along the lake by stationing a strong garrison at the castle of Vaumarcus and securing the old Roman road slightly upstream with a field guard. The following night, the Confederates advanced along both routes simultaneously. The main force attacked the castle, while a reconnaissance force of about 2,500 men pushed along the old Roman road. Charles responded by abandoning his strong position at dawn on the 2nd of March to move out and meet the enemy. Just as his troops were crossing the plain near Goncies, the Swiss vanguard appeared at the edge of the forest north of the village. The encounter was completely unexpected for both sides. Neither knew the other's movements or plans, and neither had prepared a position or tactics. What followed was what is known in military jargon as a battle of encounter. When Charles spotted the Swiss, he immediately ordered his men to prepare for battle. The Swiss vanguard, however, was too small to attack on its own, even though the Burgundians were still on the move, and thus in a vulnerable position. Instead, a few skirmishers opened fire to maintain pressure, until the main force arrived, which had to laboriously fight its way through the dense forests along the lake shore. When the first part of the main Swiss force arrived around noon, the Confederates formed one of their infamous Gewalthaufen, a massive formation. Around 2,000 men established a square, its outer edges made up of heavily armored pikemen, closing like a shield around a mass of halberdiers and axemen. The skirmishers waited on the right flank for their turn to act. The Gewalthaufen was the Swiss response to armies of heavily armored men-at-arms.
This development most likely dates back to the Old Zurich Wars, that is to the mid-15th century, and relied on sheer numbers and force.
When a Gewalthaufen attacked, it resembled a human avalanche, advancing at a run and crushing everything in its path. The rhythmic pounding of thousands of feet, The deafening battle cries and the blood-curdling roar of the Swiss horns shook the enemy's fighting spirit even before impact. At the point of contact, the long pikes of the fighters at the edge of the formation formed a wall that the enemy could not break through as long as the mass remained intact. The hedgehog of hundreds of steel points brought their horses to an abrupt halt, whereupon the more lightly armored men stormed out from the center of the formation, pulled the horsemen from their mounts, and cut them down. This deadly war machine now approached the cutting-edge Burgundian army on the plain near Grandson. The Swiss massed force slowly advanced a few hundred paces toward Charles's position. This brought them within range of the Burgundian artillery, which immediately opened fire in an attempt to break up the formation and give the heavy cavalry an opportunity to charge. When the Burgundian horsemen spurred their mounts and thundered toward the right flank of the Gewalthaufen, it became clear that the plan would not succeed. The Swiss had stoically endured the artillery barrage and held their formation. Instead of sweeping away a disorganized mob of intimidated men, Charles's cavalry crashed into an intact wall of pikes. The chronicler Diebold Schilling, who himself took part in the war, wrote with evident satisfaction in his Great Burgundian Chronicle, quote, "The Swiss struck the Burgundian horsemen so manfully in the nose that they turned around and ran away." End quote. After the failure of this first attempt to quickly decide the battle, Charles began to implement a more sustained and reliable plan that would bring the full firepower of his artillery to bear. To ensure a clean line of fire, Charles ordered the infantry forming the front line to position themselves beside or behind the guns. Just as the Burgundians were about to take up their new positions, the rest of the Confederates arrived. The second part of the main force on the Roman road, and the rear guard along the lakeside path. Now, things moved quickly. Without hesitation, the new arrivals charged toward the enemy in a concentric attack, accompanied by thunderous war cries. The waiting mass of troops joined in the assault. This sudden onslaught caught the Burgundians off guard, as they had not completed their maneuver. The rear ranks did not know what was happening. They saw only the charging Swiss and heard the din of battle. Consequently, they mistook the movement of the infantry, which was making way for the artillery, for a retreat or even a rout. Almost immediately, panic spread and the men turned to flee, shouting, "Sauve qui peut," every man for himself. Charles desperately tried to keep his army together, but it was too late. The battle was over before it had really begun. When the Swiss entered the Burgundian camp after the battle, they found riches beyond their wildest dreams. Works of art, fine cloth, provisions, weapons, and above all, Charles's formidable artillery.
It represented an incalculable yet immense material loss, or rather, a redistribution of these goods. These were not merely material possessions that could be sold, but above all, symbols of Charles the Bold's authority seized by the victors.
With this legendary treasure, which became known as Burgunderbeute, the Burgundian loot, the Confederates set off for home. The Battle of Grandson was a complete success for them. However, in the weeks that followed, the Confederates did nothing to capitalize on their victory at Grandson. They were fully occupied with transporting their spoils and had no cavalry to pursue Charles. Bern wanted to occupy the area around Lake Neuchâtel to deprive the Burgundians of their base of operations, but the other cantons were convinced that the Bernese were once again only interested in seizing Vaud for themselves. Even when it became clear that Charles was preparing a second strike, the Federal Diet continued to reject preventive measures.
Well, the Confederates, that is Bern's allies, were not enthusiastic. They were aware that sooner or later this would lead to a request or even a demand from Bern that they supported based on the alliance treaties. However, these treaties only provided for such support in the event of a defensive situation, that is, an incursion into the territory in question, in which case the respective cities or cantons would act. As I said, the Confederates had differing interests from central Switzerland, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden. They were focused on the south. Zurich had stronger interests in the north, and it was Bern with its allies, especially Fribourg, that had interests in the west.
Accordingly, the Diet made it unmistakably clear that the other cantons would only intervene if the Burgundians set foot on Bernese soil. To at least secure the border, Bern subsequently reinforced the strategically important town of Murten with 1,500 men under Adrian von Bubenberg. The only ones who supported them were the men from Fribourg, who sent 100 men under William of Affry into the town. The Burgundians had lost the battle, but not the war. Because the fighting had been so brief and the Confederates had no cavalry to pursue his men, Charles the Bald had lost only around 1,000 men.
The Battle of Grandson was ultimately the battle before the battle. Its outcome was surprising. The Swiss had not expected it to end so lightly, but above all, so successfully for them. They captured an enormous amount of loot by completely plundering Charles the Bold's camp. It remains the largest haul from a medieval battle, and well, for Charles the Bold, the outcome was also unexpected. He had anticipated neither this raid nor the flight of his cavalry. For him, this meant not only a significant material loss, but above all, an absolute loss of honor. That is also the reason why it was immediately clear to everyone involved that another battle was inevitable.
Even as he was retreating, Charles the Bald was already making plans for his next attack. He thirsted for revenge. Charles the Bald arrived in Lausanne on the 14th of March 1476. He immediately began reorganizing his army, rebuilding his artillery, and recruiting additional troops. Over the next few weeks, reinforcements poured into the Burgundian camp from all directions, until a new army was finally ready on the 28th of May. Without a clear objective, but determined to get his revenge, Charles the Bald set out northward. Near Avenches, he encountered a reconnaissance party from the Bernese garrison of Murten. Upon learning that Murten was the most important Bernese border fortress, he decided to capture the town and then advance directly on Bern. On the 9th of June, the defenders of Murten spotted the Burgundian army on the horizon. They watched as Charles set up the camp on the Bois de Domingue, or Bodemünzi, a wooded hill, and divided his men. The Count of Romont and the reserve unit under Antoine, the Bastard of Burgundy, Charles's half-brother, besieged the town, while the rest of the troops secured the army against any attempt by the Swiss to break the siege. To this end, they established a long artillery-equipped field fortification above the town known as the Grünhag. At the same time, Charles dispatched strong assault units to establish bridgeheads near Arberg, Gummenen, and Laupen. However, this was a tactical error. Because the Bernese had meanwhile secured the surrounding area with the help of Fribourg, Solothurn, and Biel, they bloodily repelled all three advances. More serious, however, was the fact that during these attacks, the Burgundians penetrated Bernese territory, thereby triggering the Confederates' defensive alliance. Charles suddenly found himself facing not just Bern, but the entire Old Confederacy and the Lower League. While the 8 cantons mobilized their troops, the defenders of Murten under Adrian von Bubenberg feverishly prepared for the siege. Together with the men, women, and children who had remained in Murten, the garrison reinforced the walls. The mercenary Ludwig Seiler reported in a letter to the government of Lucerne that, quote, "women, men, and children, indeed everyone, is working diligently in the town and have erected another bastion between the ramparts." At the same time, they brought supplies into the city and positioned additional artillery, mostly guns captured at Grandson. A besieged town lives or dies by practical knowledge. How do you reinforce defenses, secure food and water, protect livestock, make essential supplies last, and keep a community functioning when the systems people depend on begin to fail? Which raises an interesting question. If our own civilization faced a serious continuity problem, how much of that knowledge would we still have? Luckily, today's sponsor has you covered. The book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization. This is not just any survival manual. It is a beautifully illustrated guide, packed with practical knowledge. From purifying water to building shelter, to protecting livestock from wild animals, making soap, and even working out how to produce penicillin or gunpowder from scratch. Inside, you will also find guides to making fire, finding clean water, generating electricity, navigating while sailing, and producing everyday essentials, such as toothpaste, paper, glue, and duct tape. Every page features detailed hand-drawn sketches, making it as enjoyable to browse as it is useful to read. Whether you are interested in old world skills, history, or simply want a book that makes you feel a little more prepared for the unexpected, the book is a fascinating read and a great conversation piece. You can get your copy through the link in the description or the pinned comment below. Now back to Murten, where the Burgundians were about to put those preparations to the test. When the Burgundians approached the walls, von Bubenberg's artillery greeted them with a thunderous barrage. Despite suffering heavy casualties from the bombardment, Charles kept up the pressure. To Charles, Murten was merely a stepping stone on the road to Bern. He hoped for a swift victory, and indeed, despite fierce resistance, the Burgundians made steady progress. The defenders and their walls grew weaker by the day. On the 17th and the 18th of June, the Burgundian artillery razed parts of the southern wall. This was followed by the most dangerous assault yet. For 8 hours, the wary garrison held out against the attackers. In the end, it was likely the fear of suffering the same fate as the garrison of Granson that gave the defenders the strength to hold out one last time. Adrian von Bubenberg wrote to Bern that another such attack would not be survivable for the garrison under any circumstances. As at Granson, the Swiss mobilization dragged on. It was not until the 13th of June, nearly 10 days after the Bernese first requested help, that the troops from the other cantons set out. The Zurich forces were the last to arrive at the Confederates' camp near Ulmitz in the early morning of the 22nd of June. They had covered the 140 kilometers from Zurich to Murten in just 3 days. In total, the Swiss army numbered about 25,000 men, including 1,800 cavalry sent by René II of Lorraine and the Lower League. The Burgundian army, with 23,000 men, was outnumbered but possessed more artillery and cavalry. This time, Charles the Bold had carefully chosen the battlefield. He intended to engage the Swiss on a plateau above Murten, where he could position his artillery ideally. The terrain was perfectly suited for his superior cavalry, and the Grün Haag on the eastern side offered protection. However, the Burgundians were nervous. When their scouts reported movement in the Swiss camp, Charles ordered his men to take up positions on the battlefield. In full armor, they waited for the enemy for several hours in heavy, steady rain. But the attack never came, and eventually the Duke sent his men back to their tents. When another false alarm occurred on the following day, Charles lost confidence in his scouts. He decided to reconnoiter the Swiss camp himself. On the 21st of June, he had his troops form up for the third time and set out. What he found did not worry him in the least. For reasons that remain unclear, he believed that only a small vanguard was encamped near Ulmitz, whose task was to deceive him and draw him away from the siege. Determined not to fall for it, he sent his men, who for the third time had been waiting in the pouring rain, fully armed for hours, back to the camp. Only a field guard of 2,000 infantrymen, a handful of archers, and 1,200 cavalry remained at the Grün Haag. Even when a reconnaissance party of 1,300 mounted men was spotted on the edge of the battlefield in the early morning of the 22nd of June, Charles merely ordered his men to don their armor and stand ready in camp. Thus, the element of surprise lay with the Confederates. As they prepared on the morning of the 22nd of June, they were determined not to let the Burgundians get off scot-free again. Fittingly, the Swiss Diet had recently adopted a new military code prohibiting the taking of prisoners. Experience had shown that the prospect of ransom and plunder tempted many men to focus on capturing a noble enemy rather than on the fight itself. This was not to be the case in this battle. When the rain finally let up at noon, the Confederates formed their battle lines and advanced slowly through the forest toward the Grünhag, until the enemy came into view. Then they said their battle prayer. The vanguard, consisting mainly of men from Bern, Fribourg and Schwyz, opened the battle with an assault on the Grünhag. As soon as they emerged from the forest, they came under a fierce hail of arrows. Nevertheless, they advanced, until the Burgundian field fortifications blocked their path. The men from Schwyz, fighting on the right flank, reacted with lightning speed. They sprinted forward, bypassed the obstacle on the right, and attacked the field guard from behind. The fighting was bloody, but after a short while the Grünhag collapsed, and the path to the Burgundian camp lay open. To prevent the enemy from regrouping, the vanguard immediately pressed on, sweeping aside everything in its path. The main force of 15,000 men under Hans Waldmann now burst out of the forest and advanced in a wide arc toward the Burgundian camp to encircle the enemy. The cavalry rode directly toward the Bois de Domingue to shield the infantry from the Burgundian horse. Following this rapid advance, the Swiss gradually tightened their deadly encirclement. By the time the alarm was sounded in the Burgundian camp, it was too late. The Swiss were already standing before the tents, and with no time to form proper battle lines, the unprepared Burgundians had to fight where they stood. They put up a desperate resistance, but all their efforts were in vain. Only in the cavalry engagement, now in full swing, did Charles's troops retain the upper hand. It was not until the arrival of the main force that the Lorraine cavalry succeeded in driving back the Burgundian horsemen as well. The Swiss opening strike had been swift, hard, and decisive. Charles was stunned. Although he had prepared thoroughly, his enemies were about to overrun him once again. The only thing left to do was flee. It is said that at Murten, only the speed of his horse saved his life. The vanguard of the Confederates immediately took up the pursuit. Meanwhile, the main force completed the encirclement. It reached the lake at Greng and Fou and then tightened the noose, while the Burgundians desperately tried to break out of the deadly trap. Only a few got away. Most were cut down or driven into the lake, where they drowned. When Adrian von Bubenberg saw what was happening outside the town, he sent a detachment of hand-picked men beyond the walls. The sortie charged forward, attacked Antoine of Burgundy, and pinned down Charles de Gaulle's half-brother until he, too, had no way to escape. The men of the Count of Romont fled before the same fate could befall them. The Battle of Murten was a disaster for Charles the Bald and is, therefore, regarded by many historians as the decisive battle of the Burgundian Wars.
Murten stands out for two reasons. First, because of the staggering number of casualties. Everyone agrees that the majority of Charles the Bald's infantry was wiped out. The figures vary between 8,000 and 20,000, though 10,000 is the most commonly cited number. That is an almost incomprehensible number of men killed between noon and evening. It also led to Charles the Bold being permanently weakened.
Murten was also the battle that contributed most to enhancing the Swiss reputation as warriors. Even before the Burgundian Wars, mercenaries were one of the Confederacy's most important exports.
Since the mid-15th century, the Swiss Confederacy had become a reservoir of mercenaries. This is primarily linked to the end of the Old Zurich War in the 1440s, when many battle-hardened men capable of fighting in organized formations became available. But it was the Burgundian Wars that truly established the reputation of Swiss troops as the best in Europe. By the end of the 15th century, there was fierce competition for these mercenaries. The Swiss were considered highly skilled, very expensive, and, well, ruthless.
Despite the defeat at Crançon and the disaster at Murten, Charles had no intention of admitting defeat. Even before the year 1476 had come to an end, he was raising a new army to take revenge on his enemies. But this time, Charles faced a problem. Recruitment was slow, and his authority had been severely weakened by 2 defeats, and his allies and vassals were reluctant to provide troops, fearing they would also fall victim to the Swiss killing machine. Before Charles was ready to launch another strike against the Bernese, a rebellion broke out in occupied Lorraine. Duke René II, supported by the lower League, drove out one Burgundian garrison after another and eventually recaptured the capital, Nancy. Charles was at risk of losing the centerpiece of his plan, the territory that connected his ancestral lands with the Burgundian Netherlands. He was forced to deal with the uprising first. Retribution would have to wait. Charles the Bold made short work of the rebels in Lorraine. Duke René II was vastly outmatched. He lacked the funds to pay his soldiers, morale in his army was low, and mutinies were common. Within a few weeks, it appeared he would lose Lorraine once again. On the 22nd of October, the Burgundians reached Nancy and laid siege to the city. Although they had little artillery, the city's defenses had been damaged during René II's recapture and had not yet been fully restored. Although the Lorrainers defended their capital fiercely, their situation soon became desperate, and Duke René saw no other option but to appeal to his allies for help. But the Swiss Diet, still unwilling to commit to anything beyond a defensive war against Charles, rejected Lorraine's request for assistance.
Once again, under the agreement of the lower League, there was controversy over whether this would require providing assistance. That was one issue. The second was who would finance it. René of Lorraine simply had no money.
Only when the Duke of Lorraine was able to raise funds through Basel bankers to pay his troops did the 8 cantons allow him to recruit soldiers on their territory. The recruitment campaign was quite successful and brought René around 6,000 men, but he was still not satisfied. It was not experienced, well-equipped warriors who flocked to him, but rather a motley crowd, everyone who now wanted to be part of it.
The equipment of these young men who had gone off to war was, in some cases, very poor. Some didn't even have shoes in December, and it was just before Christmas when the troops set out. He then again asked for well-equipped and experienced fighters, and to a certain extent he received them.
The newly recruited troops gathered at Basel and marched toward Alsace on the 26th of December. Near Lunéville, they met additional mercenaries whom the Duke had recruited from the lower League. Together with his forces, the army now numbered nearly 20,000 men. On the 4th of January 1477, it reached Saint-Nicolas-du-Port, a village 10 kilometers south of Nancy. There, the commanders discussed their next course of action. Given the desperate situation in Nancy, the shortage of supplies, and their current numerical advantage, they decided to attack Charles the very next day. When Charles the Bold learned that the relief army was on the march, he immediately withdrew with a large portion of his troops from the siege. Only a small contingent maintained the encirclement, preventing the defenders from attacking the Burgundian army from the rear. Charles had devised a plan to offset his army's numerical inferiority. He had just about 15,000 men. The road from Saint-Nicolas-du-Port to Nancy ran through a valley. Near the village of Charville, the valley floor narrowed to only about 400 to 500 meters. The slopes on both sides were steep and densely forested, and on the northeastern side of the plain, the river Meurthe formed a natural barrier. On this plain, protected by a stream and surrounded by dense undergrowth, Charles took up position. He deployed his army between the Meurthe and the steep slope to the southwest and awaited the enemy in his strong defensive position. The position had all the advantages and disadvantages of a bottleneck. It allowed Charles to offset his numerical inferiority by concentrating his army's firepower, especially his artillery, on a single point. But it also left him with little room to maneuver, and, in the event of defeat, Nancy blocked any route for an orderly retreat. On the morning of the 5th of January, a cold, wet winter day, the Allied army set out. When it was almost in sight of the Burgundians, it halted to explore the enemy's exact position. The leaders of the relief army immediately recognized that Charles's position was too strong for a direct frontal assault. They, therefore, agreed on a bold plan. The rearguard of about 800 skirmishers would launch a frontal attack to distract the Burgundians, while the rest of the army would split up, outflank them, and then charge from the sides. Charles had apparently not considered this possibility, believing the densely forested valley slopes to be impassable. Around noon, the main force, consisting mainly of Swiss and numbering about 8,000 men, set out on a difficult march. Heavy snowstorms and thick fog reduced visibility, and ice and snow made every step arduous. Slowly, they made their way through the forests along the flank of the valley. After about 2 hours, they reached a position above the Burgundian lines. Thanks to the dense snow, their approach had gone unnoticed. When the snowfall subsided, a short time later, the men began their descent. The Confederates formed a massive formation, sounded their war horns, stormed down the hillside shouting, and threw themselves upon the Burgundians. Charles's men were completely taken by surprise. They hastily tried to turn their guns, but there was only time for a few poorly aimed shots. The cavalry rushed to their aid, but could only briefly slow the attack before being pushed back by the Swiss pikemen. Charles then ordered the archers on his left wing to reinforce the right flank, but they were too slow. Before they had completed their redeployment, the surging mass of the Swiss Gewalthaufen had already collided with the Burgundian infantry in the center of Charles's army. The attackers seized the moment to strike from the other side as well. A second force had bypassed the Burgundian position along the Meurthe, sheltered by snow and fog, and now attacked Charles's army from the rear while its attention was focused on the threat from the west. By the time the Burgundians noticed them, they had already passed the artillery and reached the left flank. They too were met by the cavalry, but once again the Swiss pikemen cut them down within minutes. This deprived Charles of the tactical pillars on which he had built his tactic, namely artillery and cavalry. And the advantage of the bottleneck was lost. His infantry put up a desperate fight, but the attackers' numerical superiority quickly became apparent. The Burgundian formation broke and the soldiers turned and fled. Now the disadvantages of Charles's position became apparent. The fleeing soldiers ran into the garrison of Nancy, which had made a sortie, driven back the guards, and set the Burgundian camp ablaze. Trapped between the city and the Allied army, many Burgundians tried to escape across the frozen Meurthe. But the ice was too thin and they made a cold, watery grave in the river. In total, about 8,000 men lost their lives. Charles the Bold's final battle was lost.
The Battle of Nancy was ultimately an act of desperation on the part of Charles the Bold. His army had shrunk considerably. He had no men left or almost none. Shortly before the battle, key commanders also deserted him with their troops, having realized the futility of the campaign. Charles the Bold did not listen to his advisors. This is well documented. He may have made the decision out of desperation. Around half of the army he still had left was wiped out.
The Duke of Burgundy himself turned to flee, but this time his horse was too slow. His pursuers caught up to him, pulled him from the saddle, and put an end to the hated enemy. When his body was found on the 7th of January near a pond a few hundred meters from the battlefield, his chest had been pierced by 2 pike thrusts, and his head split by a halberd blow.
For his contemporaries, this truly marked the downfall of what was called the most powerful prince of Christendom, that is, the most powerful prince in the world. And well, ultimately, they could only explain it as divine judgment. Here was the most powerful prince of Christendom, and there were the poor Swiss from a barren land who had completely defeated him.
The Burgundian Wars came to an end with the defeat at Nancy and the death of Charles the Bald. At Grandson, Charles the Bald lost his goods. At Morton, his courage. At Nancy, his blood. This old proverb, which first appeared shortly after the events and is still taught in Swiss schools today, testifies to the significance of this conflict held for contemporaries. The military success against the seemingly superior Duchy of Burgundy had immense repercussions, not only on politics, but also on social and daily life within the Old Swiss Confederacy.
Contemporaries truly saw that society had completely changed. It was no longer as it had been before, and this entire orientation toward war, which would shape the history of the Old Swiss Confederacy for the next several hundred years, could no longer be reversed. If we reflect on the people of that time, they had their dead, their wounded, and their traumatized. There were families without fathers, without brothers, widows, and orphans, who had to be provided for in some way. These were drastic changes in every household, including in this region, despite the great spoils, or perhaps precisely because of them.
The Burgundian Wars were a turning point for the Swiss Confederacy and for Europe. The balance of power shifted dramatically. The Burgundian realm ceased to exist. France's political influence grew, and the House of Habsburg began its rise to become one of the most powerful dynasties of the 16th century. The Burgundian Wars were a pan-European conflict that profoundly and permanently changed not only the political structure of Europe, but also the conduct of warfare.